Well, hello. Tonight, we are going to be going through Leviticus 21 through 24. This week and next week are all that's left of Leviticus, and there was much rejoicing in the land. And tonight, what we're going to be looking at is some laws for the priests and how they're to handle issues in their family with grieving, as well as honoring the temple, or not the temple, the tabernacle, and so their own cleanliness or purity, and who can do what. But then also we're going to be talking a little bit about the holy days calendar, and then there is a passage at the last part of our section today that is going to be looking at how the people are supposed to handle a blasphemer who is has a Jewish mother, but a non-Jewish father, an Egyptian father. And so quite a range of things that we're going to talk about. But some of the things we've talked about already a little bit, and so we won't necessarily have as deep a dive on the intricacies of the festivals, but we'll just kind of talk through them. And then, any questions at the end, then we will have some time for questions. So, starting verse 1 of chapter 21, let's do this. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, a priest must not make himself ceremonially unclean for any of his people who die, except for a close relative, such as his mother or father, his son or daughter, his brother, or an unmarried sister who is dependent on him, since she has no husband, for he may make himself unclean. For her, he may make himself unclean. He must not make himself unclean for people related to him by marriage, and so defile himself. Priests must not shave their heads, or shave off the edges of their beards, or cut their bodies. They must be holy to their God, and must not profane the name of their God, because they present the food offering to the Lord, the food of their God. They are to be holy. They must not marry women defiled by prostitution or divorced from their husbands, because priests are holy to their God. Regard them as holy, because they offer up the food of your God. Consider them holy, because I, the Lord, am holy, I who make you holy. If a priest's daughter defiles herself by becoming a prostitute, she disgraces her father. She must be burned in the fire." All right, so this is a kind of a weird opening, but what's going on here is these commands about mourning, way back in the in the middle of the book, we talked through the opening up of the tabernacle, and Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu, they brought strange fire before the Lord, and they died. The Lord struck them down because of their inattention to the details. And then Aaron was mourning after that event, and so they essentially rededicated themselves to the Lord because the mourning was making them unclean. And so here we have a little bit more explanation for how the priests are to mourn, because the mourning of a dead relative, because touching a dead person would make them unclean. And so if they are serving in the tabernacle, they need to make sure that they are ceremonially pure, so as to not bring any kind of defilement in with the sacrifices to the Lord. And so here the laws are like, you can really only mourn, make yourself unclean as a priest for your immediate family. So your wife, and your children and your mother, or a sister who is not married. Anybody who is married is like if your sister is married to a man, then she is now a part of that man's family. She's no longer technically a part of your family. And so this is part of the like this clarification of the laws here, to just say, like, this is the demarcation for who you can make yourself ceremonially unclean for, if you are mourning the death of a loved one as a priest. And it's one of those things like, we don't think of this way, but also when we experience a funeral, like I have yet to come in contact with anybody in a funeral situation who said, yes, we prepared our husband, our loved one's body personally. But the priests and you know, they would have had to take care of this by themselves. There was no funeral services businesses, so they would have done this as a family. And so the priest needs to make sure that they are not defiling themselves with a dead body. Also, as a part of this, these stipulations around mourning is talking about shaving heads or shaving off their beards or cutting their bodies. And part of the research around that is like these were potentially aspects of pagan worship and pagan mourning. And so this is a way now for the priests to stand apart from the other cultures around them to say, like, when our priests are not praying to the dead or making offerings for the dead. Their offering is really only for the Lord. And so even if there is a loved one who has died, they are not to change their appearance in how they mourn. They're not supposed to like radically alter their bodies in any way. They are devoted to the Lord, and keeping with this, how they stay clean is part of the question. Then is like, well, then who can they marry? And so like the priests are not allowed to marry divorced women or women who were prostitutes. And coming back to the easiest part of this is like, why not marry a woman who was a prostitute as a priest? It was because this person was um, practicing something that was already forbidden for the people of Israel. And then also, the priests are not in any way supposed to be affiliated with any kind of uh, shrine prostitution that other cultures were participating in. And so this is a big deal, that the priests remain pure, and to eliminate any kind of appearance of defilement or ceremonial uncleanness. Furthermore, this all keeps a cleaner line on inheritance rules and regulations, because only Levites are allowed to be priests. And so if a Levite is to marry somebody who was divorced or was a prostitute, those are two different things, but either of those could potentially create some questions around, depending on when the husband died, like those kinds of questions. Whose kid could that be? And so those are another aspect of what are we concerned about here with who the priests are marrying. But it's the goal here for the priests is to remain ritually pure, to stay to eliminate any kind of confusion on their family and um, their inheritance lines. Even further, then, like this last verse that we read with the priest's daughters, which is like intense. If a priest's daughter defiles herself by becoming a prostitute, she disgraces her father. She must be burned in the fire. And this is um, again, another way of like saying like there can be no hint of prostitution in the priestly system, because all of these things are about God and worshiping the Lord rightly. And if the priest's daughter were to give herself over to prostitution, then it makes a level of confusion on shrine prostitution. What is happening here? All of those things are bad. And so she's profaning her family, dishonoring her parents. And so the punishment of this is severe. And as you read this, the way people have talked about it is the penalty for adultery and prostitution is stoning, which is a community offense. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Or a community based execution. Everybody who was wronged by the offense or harmed was to participate in the stoning. Um, and so this is not like putting her on a stake and burning her alive. She would have been executed or stoned, and then her corpse was to be burned, which is still harsh and severe when we think about it. But the goal here is purity in the priestly family. And so the priests are called to a very high standard, and there are high consequences when the priests don't live up to that standard. Let's keep going. Verse 10. The high priest, the one among his brothers who has had the anointing oil poured on his head and who has been ordained to wear the priestly garments, must not let his hair become unkempt or tear his clothes. He must not enter a place where there is a dead body. He must not make himself unclean, even for his father or mother, nor leave the sanctuary of his God or desecrate it, because he has been dedicated by the anointing oil of his God. I am the Lord. The woman he marries must be a virgin. He must not marry a widow, a divorced woman, or a woman defiled by prostitution, but only a virgin from his own people, so that he will not defile his offspring among his people. I'm the Lord who makes him holy. So all the priests, like the laws about who priests can be defiled by, close family. That's the priesthood in general. The high priest has an even higher standard. Even his father or mother, he cannot enter into like that ritual mourning, touching a dead body, or doing anything to make himself look unkempt while he's serving as the high priest. And so, like, when we think about mourning, there's different things that people would do in the Old Testament. They would tear their garments. They would wear sackcloth. They would cover themselves with ash. All of those things were a part of the mourning process. And the priest cannot do any of those things the high priest can't do any of those things when he is serving. And so he must maintain the quality of appearance that the Lord is calling him to. This seems intense. It seems strict, but it is, again, about the ritual purity, because the priests are the ones who bring the offerings. The priests are the ones who facilitate the worship, who are facilitating in the tabernacle where the very glory of God dwells. And so the priests are representing Israel to God, and they are carrying the burden of purity with them. And so so all of these things are a part of these regulations. And again, here talking about marriage, like marrying a virgin as the high priest, is again to protect the line of inheritance, because the son of the high priest would be next in line to be high priest. And so there has to be a very clear line of inheritance. There cannot be any kind of confusion there. And so this is the Lord's command. He's calling the priest to be holy because the Lord is holy. And the high priest must also marry a Levite. He can't marry somebody from outside of the tribe of Levi, because the Levites are meant to be a distinct tribe, and the high priest family is to be protected and on their inheritance. So let's pick up into verse 16. And verse 16, the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, for the generations to come, none of your descendants who has a defect may come near to offer the food of his God. No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed. No man with a crippled foot or hand, or who is a hunchback or a dwarf, or who has any eye defect, or who has any festering or running sores or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron the priest who has any defect is to come near the priest to present the food offerings to the Lord. He has a defect. He must not come near to offer the food of his God. He may eat the most holy food of God as well as the holy food, Yet because of his defect, he must not go near the curtain or approach the altar and so desecrate my sanctuary. I am the Lord who makes them holy. So Moses told this to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites. And so again, this is a one of the levels of purity. When we look at the animals that are acceptable to the offerings to the Lord, they are without blemish. They have none of the no physical defects. They're healthy. They're the pick of the litter. So the priest then also needs to, as they're making these offerings, be without any kind of physical defect as they are serving in the tabernacle. But there is a bit of grace here because remember, the Levites don't have their own land. They cannot generate food for themselves. And so they depend upon the tithes and offerings of the people and the portion that goes to the priests. And so even the members of the priestly family who are unable to serve in the tabernacle for any kind of defect like this, they are still able to eat of the food as a way of presenting. It's a way of providing for them and a sign of God's grace to them. And so, again, these high standards are intense, and the way to kind of think through this is that they are entering into the presence of the most holy king. And so walking in that level of awareness is to help the people recognize like there is a reverence for what they are doing, that they can't just do things the way that they want to. They must honor the Lord and follow his commands. Jay has a question. Is that where a shomer came into play as a mourner in place of the high priest? I am not familiar with that term, Jay, a shomer. And so we'll come back to that and maybe you could explain it a bit later. So the, yeah, I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. All right. Yeah. Let's go to chapter 22. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons to treat with respect the sacred offerings of the Israelites consecrate to me, so they will not profane my holy name. I am the Lord. Say to them for the generations to come, if any of your descendants is ceremonially unclean and yet comes near the sacred offerings that the Israelites consecrate to the Lord, that person must be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. If a descendant of Aaron has a defiling skin disease or a bodily discharge, he may not eat the sacred offering until he is cleansed. He will also be unclean if he touches something defiled by a corpse or by anyone who has an emission of semen, or if he touches any crawling thing that makes him unclean, or any person who makes him unclean, whatever the uncleanness may be. The one who touches any such thing will be unclean till evening. He must not eat any of the sacred offerings unless he has bathed himself with water. When the sun goes down, he will be clean. And after that, he may eat the sacred offerings, for they are his food. He must not eat anything found dead or torn by wild animals, and so become unclean through it. I am the Lord. The priests are to perform my service in such a way that they do not become guilty and die for treating it with contempt. I am the Lord who makes them holy. And so here, the even more clarification and stipulations about the priest who has any kind of impurity. They can't offer any kind of the offerings because their impurity will transfer onto the offering, and so they will defile that. And again, we've talked about the different things that make people unclean. Any kind of skin disease, any kind of oozing or bodily fluids, or all these different things, like they make people unclean, and so you cannot bring your offerings there if you are unclean. But also the crawling things, which are like the insects that are labeled as unclean, or the serpents, or those kinds of animals. And then corpses. Don't touch a corpse or eat an animal that you found, which is so gross. Like when you think about it, like you found an animal and you're like, I should eat that. I don't know who's thinking that, but maybe they were. But yeah, carcasses of any sort will make you unclean. Now, this is the one of those verses or those sections of the text that gives a motivation for the priest and the Levite in the parable of the Good Samaritan, because touching a carcass or blood or any of those things would make somebody unclean. And one of the key details that the Lord is saying is the priests and the Levites, as they're coming down from Jerusalem, they see the man on the side of the road and they go to the other side to avoid becoming unclean. But the key detail here is that Jesus says they are coming down from the mountain. Their work is done. And so here, what the laws are, the Lord is saying is like, if you touch an unclean thing, you cannot make an offering. You cannot bring the offering in the tabernacle. But the priest and the Levite are coming down. They've already done the work. They could help the man, and it would be good for them to help the man who has been injured. But because he is unclean, they avoid him. Looking at a passage like this, saying like, "Oh, I don't want to make myself unclean." But there is there's really no justification for not helping somebody when your work is already done. And so the Lord is, so these laws, like when we read through the New Testament and Jesus' parables, like he echoes back to these kinds of laws, and he's saying things that the people would have heard, like coming down from Jerusalem means you're done in the temple. Like that's important. That's an important detail to know. And understanding the law about touching unclean things is an important detail to know, and how Jesus turns the expectations around in that parable in particular are indications for why it is so revolutionary, because the person who serves as the better neighbor is the Samaritan, who was considered to be an unclean person by the Jewish standards. And so, but he is more compassionate than the priests and the Levites. And so Jesus is trying to help give that picture of what is a good neighbor. And so, yeah, so that is all. Don't make yourself impure, and defects of any sort. Don't offer an offering if you have a defect or an impurity, because these are God's sacrifices. They are holy, and so you must treat them with reverence. And so after the sacrifice has been made, what is the key here in verse 10? No one outside a priest's family may eat the sacred offering, nor may the guests of a priest or his hired worker eat it. And so only the priests are allowed, and their family are allowed to eat these things. But if a priest buys a slave with money, or if slaves are born in his household, they may eat his food. And again, the Bible has these commands about slavery, and in our 21st century sensibility, it's like, why is this here? And so it's not ideal, but there is a level of grace even in this passage, is saying that if the priest buys a slave, that slave is now a part of their family. It's a part of their household, and they must care for them. They cannot deprive them of the food of the priest's house. And so that's an important part. Like, as we look at this, like, yeah, we would love for the Bible to not have any slavery references in it, but even in the slavery references, there are elements of provision and grace that are not necessary, but God commanded these laws because there is a compassion for the people who find themselves in these situations. If a priest's daughter marries anyone other than a priest, she may not eat of the sacred contributions. But if a priest's daughter becomes a widow or is divorced, yet has no children, and she returns to live in her father's household as in her youth, she may eat her father's food. No unauthorized persons, however, may eat it. Because as we said at the beginning, if a woman marries a man, she is now a part of his family. And so if she leaves a priestly family to marry a family that is not priests, then she is no longer really considered a part of the line of Levi. She's now a part of that family. And so the catch, though, is if she doesn't have any kids, or she's a widow, or her husband leaves her, and she doesn't have any children, then she can come back to her father's house. And so there's even a social safety net there for single women and widows and divorced people to be able to be brought back into the care of her father's house. Anyone who eats a sacred offering by mistake must make restitution to the priest for the offering and add a fifth to the value of it. The priest must not desecrate the sacred offerings the Israelites present to the Lord by allowing them to eat the sacred offerings and so bring upon them guilt requiring payment. I am the Lord who makes them holy. And so how would you accidentally eat a sacred offering? Well, if there are some elements that could only be eaten in the tabernacle. There are some elements that could be brought home and eaten with the family. And so that food that could be from the tabernacle and the offerings, could be kept with other food that the priests had. And so making sure that if they had a guest over from another tribe, making sure that they did not serve the food from the tabernacle to these guests. So that was the priest's responsibility. And so if somebody did it on accident and they didn't realize, they had to make it right. And so because one, they are technically eating what is the priest's livelihood, and it's like his only real the only source of food that the priest could really depend upon was what came from the tabernacle. And so they would have to, if somebody ate it on accident, they have to make it right. But if the priest was not paying attention and they were serving food to people that was from the tabernacle, then that's the priest's fault. And he's bringing guilt on those people who did not know that they were doing that. And so the priest had to take these things seriously to make sure that they were not minimizing the importance of these different foods or any of the elements from the Lord's tabernacle and the sacrifices. Let's pick up verse 17. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and his sons, to all the Israelites, and say to them, if any of you, whether an Israelite or a foreigner residing in Israel, presents a gift for a burnt offering to the Lord, either to fulfill a vow or as a freewill offering, you must present a male without defect from the cattle, sheep, or goats in order that it may be accepted on your behalf. Do not bring anything with a defect, because it will not be accepted on your behalf. When anyone brings from the Lord, brings from the herd or flock a fellowship offering to the Lord to fulfill a special vow, or as a freewill offering, it must be without defect or blemish to be acceptable. Do not offer to the Lord the blind, the injured, the maimed, or anything with warts or festering, running sores. Do not place any of these on the altar as a food offering presented to the Lord. You may, however, present as a freewill offering an ox or a sheep that is deformed or stunted, but it will not be accepted in fulfillment of a vow. You must not offer to the Lord an animal whose testicles are bruised, crushed, torn, or cut. You must not do this in your own land, and you must not accept such animals from the hand of a foreigner and offer them as the food of your God. They will not be accepted on your behalf, because they are deformed and have defects. The Lord said to Moses, when a calf, a lamb, or a goat is born, it is to remain with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day on, it will be acceptable as a food offering presented to the Lord. Do not slaughter a cow or a sheep and its young on the same day. When you sacrifice a thank offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It must be eaten that same day. Leave none of it till morning. I am the Lord. Keep my commands and follow them. I am the Lord. Do not profane my holy name, for I must be acknowledged as holy by the Israelites. I am the Lord who made you holy and who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. And so this list of animals that are not acceptable parallels the list of priests who are not allowed to make offerings. Any kind of defect as for an animal that is part of fulfilling a vow. And so, like, what is fulfilling a vow? Like, well, if you were to say, Lord, I will, I because of your generosity, I am promising to you to make this offering as a way of worshiping you, and because I promised to you that I would honor you with the bounty of my harvest. Like, you're making that kind of a vow. then that vow in the name of the Lord needs to be a pure, undefiled animal that is being offered. Now, let's just say this person is saying, like, I just want to have a free will offering and just say, God is good. Let's make an offering, just saying God is good. It has no connection to sin or any kind of festival. It is just a day, like it's Thursday and God is good. And so that can be an animal with a defect, because it is just an act of just acknowledging God's goodness as a free will offering. And those offerings, like the vows and all those different things, those are supposed to be eaten that day and not taken over into the next day, not taken out of the tabernacle. But like a free will offering, it could be something that could be eaten up to 3 days later, as we read earlier in the book of Leviticus. But yeah, so this is like, again, the same kind of principles for the priests are carrying over in with the animals that are acceptable for the offerings. And so there's an interesting little law here as well, starting in verse 26. When a calf, a lamb, or a goat is born, is to remain with its mother for 7 days. And there's no real explanation for why 7 days is the law. And after 8 days, it can be offered. Seems strange to, like, I don't know why you would want to do that. And the text doesn't say why you would want to do it. And so what it could be is, people thinking that there's maybe some kind of pagan cultic behavior that was maybe influencing a prohibition against sacrificing a newborn calf, or like maybe some why would anybody want to sacrifice the mother and the child on the same day? There's no real explanation for it. It is just strange, but it goes back to like thinking about do not boil a calf in its mother's milk. Again, that's part of a potentially pagan cultic ritual. And so this is could be one more protection against that kind of thing, to just say it's just cruel. It's cruel to sacrifice a calf in the first week of its life. And it's cruel to sacrifice a calf and its mother on the same day. And so these commands are ultimately about trying to honor the Lord and make sure that their offerings are in line with what would best honor him. And so they're trying to preserve the holiness of the people, the tabernacle, and the priests, and all to make sure that they're in alignment and not bringing any kind of defiling work into the cultic worship system of the tabernacle. And even here, the Lord is giving these laws for their benefit, for their protection. And he wants them to know his favor. And so he's telling them, this is what is acceptable. If he didn't do this, he would just be a capricious God who just doesn't tell them what is good or bad, and they will never know. And so here the Lord is telling them clearly what they can and cannot do, what he approves and what he disapproves, and also who is allowed to bring these offerings. So, yeah, so that's verse 22. And let's chapter 23 gets into the festivals. There are spring festivals and there are fall festivals. And a lot of them are highlighting or ending up around early harvest and the full harvest. And it's a new year, like they have 2 New Years essentially in the spring, and at the harvest time, there's like these 2 New Year bookends. And so so let's just jump to 23. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. And so there's several places where we see these different festivals listed. And so we'll talk about them again in the coming weeks and months, but they are marking the various stages of the agricultural year. They celebrate harvest and give both credit and a sacrificial portion back to God, who has provided for their bounty. And several of also of these became related to historical events. And so, but then also the Sabbath is listed. So while it's not technically a feast day, it is a day that is sacred to the Lord. And so it starts with the Sabbath. There are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work, whether you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. And at this point, we don't know. It says like a day of sacred assembly. We don't know what those sacred assemblies look like yet in this part of the text. Like they just know like you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And so if they're like the discipline of going to synagogue that would develop over time, like that's the kind of sacred assembly that happens over the years and years that come. But like right now, like it might be that as they're all in the camp, like the sacred assembly is to come to the tabernacle and worship together, maybe give instruction and teaching. But then as they go into the land, the people will spread out and coming to Jerusalem or wherever the tabernacle is established in Hebron or Bethel, like all these different places. It doesn't make sense for the people to travel that far every week. And so they would start gathering in their towns. And so the earliest we see anything in the law about these sacred assemblies would be Deuteronomy 31. But the Sabbath has a theological piece to remember God's creative work, remember God's power. Also has a humanitarian piece to say you need to rest. If you are not resting, you are not worshiping God. You're not honoring him. You're not trusting him. You need to rest. And so it is a day dedicated to the Lord. The next is festival or the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which they go hand in hand. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days, you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days, present a food offering to the Lord. And on the seventh day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. And so this Feast of Unleavened Bread is bookended by 2 days of no work, and sacred assemblies are on those days. But all throughout the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they cleared out all the yeast from their home, and so they're only eating very thin cracker-like bread, matzah. If you wanted to find some in the grocery store, you can find some matzah. That's the kind of bread that they were eating. And so this was so it started with the Passover meal and then a week of eating the unleavened bread. This bread was made from newly harvested grain. And so this early harvest is starting with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then after the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the offering, the first fruits. It says, verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you and you reap its harvest, bring the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb a year old without defect, together with its grain offering and 2/10 ephah of an ephah and of the finest flour mixed with olive oil, a food offering presented to the Lord, a pleasing aroma, and his drink offering of 1/4 of a hin of wine. You must not eat any bread or roasted or new grain until the very day you bring this offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come wherever you live. And so this first fruits offering is bringing that the first part of the harvest and offering it to the Lord as a way of saying, Lord, thank you for making this harvest possible, and we are giving our first to you. And one of the things that we see here is like they're not allowed to eat any bread or roasted new grain until they offer this new harvest, the first fruits of the harvest. And so it's kind of what opens up their freedom to enjoy the rest of the harvest. And so the priest would wave it back and forth, dedicating it to the Lord as a part of the offerer's behalf. And this is one of the things that the priest would then be able, because God doesn't eat this food and they're not putting it on the altar to burn it up. They are taking it, and then the priest would be able to eat this for their household. But who is able to offer this grain? Only the priests who are ceremonially pure. So any of the priests with any kind of defect or skin disease or anything like that is not able to do this at this time. And so it's all connected. But once they did do this with the lamb, the hin of wine, the fine oil or fine flour with the olive oil, all of these things are offered to the Lord, and then they're able to eat. Verse 15, from the day after the Sabbath day, you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, count off 7 full weeks, count off 50 days up to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves made of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour, baked with yeast, as a wave offering of first fruits to the Lord. Present with this bread 7 male lambs, each a year old and without defect, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They will be a burnt offering to the Lord, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Then sacrifice 1 male goat for a sin offering and 2 lambs, each a year old, for a fellowship offering. The priest is to wave the 2 lambs before the Lord as a wave offering, together with the bread of the first fruits. They are a sacred offering to the Lord for the priests. On that same day, you are to proclaim a sacred assembly and do no regular work. This is to be a lasting ordinance to the generations to come wherever you live. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. And so this is 50 days after the offering of first fruits. They count off the 7 weeks and they celebrate the Festival of Weeks, what will later become known as Pentecost, because that is the Latinized way of 50, as counting to 50. And so they are bringing the harvest, the fruits of their harvest, these loaves and these animals, and making these sacrifices to the Lord. And this is one of the festivals that they needed to come to Jerusalem, or to the tabernacle for, and in the future they would need to come to Jerusalem. It was a pilgrimage festival. And so these offerings are a lot. Like if you look at what they are bringing, they're bringing 7 male lambs, a young bull, and 2 rams. They're bringing a lot of different things to the Lord. But one of the things that is noted here in this offering is they are able now to bring loaves with leaven in them to this as a wave offering, not as a burnt offering, but the loaves are a wave to the Lord. It's not put up onto the altar to burn, but it is a wave offering. And so the Passover, the Festival of Unleavened Bread, both of those celebrate the Lord's deliverance from the old land. The offering of the first fruits and the Festival of Weeks celebrated his provision in the new land. And instead of looking to the Canaanite gods for those false gods and looking to those for any kind of blessing, the Lord was calling them to trust him to provide for their agricultural needs, and to remember that God is the one who delivered them from the land of slavery, and he would provide for them in the land of the promise. So that's what those festivals in the springtime are focusing in on. In the fall, we have the Festival of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Festival of Tabernacles. So the verse 23. The The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, on the first day of the 7th month, you are to have a day of Sabbath rest, a sacred assembly commemorated with the trumpet blasts. Do no regular work, but present a food offering to the Lord." So this is the Feast of Trumpets, and so this is another one of the pilgrimage festivals where they would come in, and usually we would consider September. They would come and they would blow these shofars, these trumpets, to the Lord, as a way of uh, acknowledging who is their God, and is a kind of musical prayer acknowledging and requesting the Lord's favor in the coming year. And since the Lord is the one commanding them to do this, he will surely hear their prayer. So that is on the first day of the 7th month, so sometime in September. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and deny yourselves and present a food offering to the Lord. Do not do any work on that day, because it is the Day of Atonement, when atonement is made for you before the Lord your God. Those who do not deny themselves on the day must be cut off from their people. I will destroy from among their people anyone who does any work on that day. You shall do no work at all. It is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Wherever you live, it is a day of Sabbath rest for you, and you must deny yourselves from the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening. You are to observe your Sabbath." And so we talked about the Day of Atonement when we looked at Leviticus 16 and the actual ins and outs of how that is all carried out. And so here the Lord is just giving more clarification that they're fasting, they're not doing any work. This is a day of rest and reflection as the priest brings in the offerings into the tabernacle, purifies himself, purifies the tabernacle, and sends the scapegoat out into the wilderness. And so this is a very holy day for the people. And so because it is holy, they do no work. They take the Sabbath rest. Verse 33. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the 7th month of the Lord's festival of tabernacles begins, and it lasts for 7 days. The first day is a sacred assembly. Do no regular work. For 7 days, present food offerings to the Lord. And on the 8th day, hold a sacred assembly and present a food offering to the Lord. It is the closing special assembly. Do no regular work. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies for bringing food offerings to the Lord, the burnt offering and the grain offerings, the sacrifices and drink offerings required for each day. These offerings are in addition to those for the Lord's Sabbaths, and in addition to your gifts and whatever you have vowed, and all the freewill offerings you give to the Lord." So beginning with the 15th day of the 7th month, after you have gathered the crops of the land, celebrate the festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day is a Sabbath rest, and the 8th day also is a Sabbath rest. On the first day, you are to take branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Celebrate it in the 7th month. Live in temporary shelters for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in such shelters, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when I brought them out of Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. So Moses announced to the Israelites the appointed festivals of the Lord. So the final festival is the Feast of Tabernacles. This is also around the final time of the harvest for the autumn. And so all of these things are part of celebrating God's provision for them. And in the tabernacles, they're living outside in these booths to remember how God sustained them when they had no land. And so while they are in the land, they may be getting comfortable, they may be getting complacent. And so the Feast of Tabernacles is supposed to help them remember how God provided for them. And so these different festivals, they're all part of embodying their faith. It's not just something that you read about and you're like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Cool story, Grandpa. But it is about embodying and reenacting the faith and the elements of God's redemption for the people. And if you are watching The Chosen by any chance, you can, if you haven't, we could talk about that another time. But Jesus and his disciples in season 2, they are living in temporary structures, and like it would be like those for the Feast of Tabernacles. And even then, they're preparing for that feast at one point in the season, and so like you can kind of see like how people could have approached this. But all of these different fruit leaves, branches, all this different stuff is about highlighting the bounty and the lusciousness of God's creation and how he provides for his people. And so these commands, one of the notes is that they are for native born Israelites. The Lord is assuming that there will be foreigners among them. They are not required to follow the Feast of Tabernacles as foreigners, but the Israelites are. The foreigners are not prohibited from observing these different feasts, but the Lord is making it very clear that the Israelites need to do these things. They need to hold these festivals because this is part of the way that they continue to pass on the Exodus story for future generations, and to maintain reverence for the Lord in all things. All right, chapter 24. The Lord said to Moses, command the Israelites to bring you clear oil of pressed olives for the light of the lamps, so they may keep burning continually outside the curtain that shields the ark of the covenant law in the tent of meeting. Aaron is to tend the lamps before the Lord from evening till morning continually. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. The lamps on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord must be tended continually. Take the finest flour and bake 12 loaves of bread using 2/10 of an ephah for each loaf. Arrange them in 2 stacks, to 6 in each stack, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. By each stack, put some pure incense and a memorial portion to represent the bread and the food offering presented to the Lord. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in the sanctuary area, because it is the most holy part of their perpetual share of the food offerings presented to the Lord. And so we talked about the table of presence that's in the tabernacle before the Lord, before the Lord's glory in the holy place. And so they were trading out that bread regularly because those 12 loaves represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the oil must be pure. The bread must be continually refreshed as part of the ongoing acts of worship that the priests are to maintain. And so we talked about that several weeks ago. This is the bread that David's men ate when he was on the run from Saul. And so, so it was a deviation from the Lord's command, but the Lord provided for David in that moment. Jesus even calls back to that in his ministry. But verse 10, this is where we get a clarification of some law through an act that the people were confused. So verse 10, now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse. So they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomit, the daughter of Debri the Danite. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. Then the Lord said to Moses, take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them, whether foreigner or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. You are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God. Then Moses spoke to the Israelites, and they took the blasphemer outside the camp and stoned him. The Israelites did as the Lord commanded. And so, in this situation, the question for the people is, this person is the son of an Israelite mother, but he has an Egyptian father. So he's not a full Israelite. And so how are they supposed to handle this situation? And so, because blasphemy is is punishable by death for the Israelites, the hesitation is like, well, he's not 100%. So what do we do? But the blasphemy of the Lord and the Lord's name is severe. And so what the Lord commands them to do is, all those who heard him make this blasphemous statement, they put their hands on him. Now, where else have we seen the putting of hands on something with the sacrifices? The priests, the people, they lean on the animal, essentially transferring their sin onto this animal. With the Day of Atonement, the priest puts his hands on the scapegoat, transferring the sins of the people onto the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is led out to the wilderness. So here, the people are putting their hands on the blasphemer, those who heard him, saying, "You're taking our offense," and they're putting that on him. And all who are offended by this, the whole assembly, are to then stone him. And this is it is the community taking responsibility for a high, grievous sin. So anytime that we see stoning happening or being called for in the Bible, it's because the offense is so important that it affects the whole community. And so the community then has to do the work of purifying the camp, essentially. And so that's what they do with this person. But in the middle between when they say what they're going to do and when they actually go and do it, we get this verses 17 through 22, which, in modern law is called lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's a equal retribution for a wrong committed. And this is a limitation on vengeance and retribution in the Old Testament. So you cannot, if somebody kills somebody, a family member of the one who was murdered cannot go and then murder an entire family. It's life for life. And so if somebody breaks your arm, you have the right to break their arm, but you can't break both their arms. So it's fracture for fracture. And so in the law, there is a limitation for how much you can bring in retribution. And one of the things to keep in mind is the Old Testament law here, there is no sense of prison or jail. There is restitution through restoring what has been stolen or lost or damaged, or there is retribution, which is immediate, and it is not something to be drawn out in a long legal battle and court cases. The one exception is where we see, and we'll get to this in a few weeks, but when we see the idea of manslaughter, where somebody kills somebody on accident, they will be allowed to go to a city of refuge that will be spread throughout the region of Israel, and that city of refuge is where they could go to wait for the investigation around the death, so that the avenger of blood from the family of that is grieving, like, they can't kill that person when they're in a city of refuge. They have to wait, and there's an investigation. And that's really the only instance where there could be any kind of prolonged waiting. Throughout the Bible, that human justice is intended to happen pretty quickly. in these different things, because it's just one more way that the Lord wanted the people to not take forever to determine these things, but to be quick and swift and limit what you would do to others for retribution. All right. So any questions? We went through a lot of stuff. But yeah, any questions for Leviticus 21 through 24?
So in Leviticus 21, when they're talking to the priests about who they can make themselves ceremonially unclean.
That's hard to say, right, Christy?
It is.
I've had to say it a bunch of times.
Yeah, it is very difficult. The list here looks like it's only blood relatives. They don't specifically mention his spouse.
Right.
And then but then it also says he must not make himself unclean for people related to him by marriage. Would that include his wife?
Well, that is up for debate. That is not like 100% clear, because as soon as he marries somebody, she is now his household. She is his family.
Right.
But her mom or dad is who he's related to by marriage.
Right.
He can't make himself unclean for her family.
Right.
And so that's the most logical explanation for this. Like, it would be cruel. It would be overly cruel to not allow the priest to mourn for his wife.
Right.
So sometimes, like, you read the Bible, like, why didn't they say this specifically? But I do think there is an assumption that we can take that she is now a part of his household because of the way that they talk about the priest's daughter. Like, if she marries somebody else, she's somebody else's household, but she can come back. Right. And so there's the way, again, this is not, 21st century sensibilities, but the women were not considered like high value.
Right.
So like they really were like, you are now his, you are not an individual person.
Right.
Which again, that's foreign to our idea in the world. But yeah, while it does not specifically say his wife, she is his.
Right.
So if he can mourn for a son who he is related to through blood by marriage with this person,
right,
then the wife has to be a part of this. Right.
Yeah. I was just wondering if it was a translation thing, no,
it's not a translation thing. It's just a weird
cultural assumption.
Yeah, that's where I would put it. So
yeah. Okay.
All right. Any other questions? That's a good catch, Christy. Yeah. Jay, you're back. What did you mean by, is that where a shomer came into play?
So I don't know too much about them. I just kind of ran across them, and I ran across it in just some research that I was doing at one point. And from what I understand, a shomer is a watchman. They're not somebody who can be they're not somebody who can be forced into doing this job. They're somebody who you have to ask to do that, and sometimes they're employed by a family or by the synagogue in order to watch over a body, to be there for that morning when family can't be there. Because apparently, according to religious laws, there or Jewish religious laws, you have to have a vigil for the body overnight in order to watch over it and things like that. And so you would employ somebody known as a shomer to come and do that. They have other things that they do, but when you said that a high priest could not go and be a part of the mourning for his own family, I was wondering if maybe that's where that came from. And I have to say, Jason, you kind of let me down. I figured that you, of all people, would know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to just make something up. So I'm looking up.
I believe you.
I'm looking up shomer in Hebrew, and the only occurrence here, I'm just using my word study stuff here. So, is father of one of Joash's murderers, or father of a hero of David. Yeah. So the only real shomer, here it is, watching, vigil, observance, a night of vigils, shomer Shabbos, observing, watching Sabbath. But I'm not seeing anything in here about a person being a shomer. Like it is a observe and a watch, but I'm not finding anything in line with that. So
Shomrim, Shomrim.
Shamrin, I am.
Rim. Yep, I am.
No, I don't have anything. Yeah, well, the I am is the plural, so it'd be like those who watch is what that would be getting at.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm not sure, Jay. That's a really good question. So, but Shomer Shabbos from the Big Lebowski. That's why Walter doesn't roll on Saturdays. Shomer Shabbos.
Such a great movie.
It is a movie I've seen.
Okay.
And there are many things funny about it. The adults are talking, Donnie. Yeah, it's very funny. It's a very funny movie. So, all right. Yeah, but good question, Jay. And maybe I'll try to do a little digging here because I'm very curious. Because there are things that people do in tradition that are not necessarily in the Bible. And so one of the things that Jewish tradition will develop over time is they will hire a Gentile to do work for them on the Sabbath. Like those kinds of things happened over time. And so I don't know if this idea of somebody watching over a corpse while the priest is doing their duty, I don't know if this is a tradition that developed over time. I'm not familiar with it in the scripture anywhere.
Okay.
So, yeah. But it could be, and maybe I'm just not remembering rightly. So, yeah. But good question, Jay.
Thanks, man.
Any other thoughts or questions from this passage? No? All right. Well, y'all, the fall is a wonderful time of year. And I do think it is one of the indicators of God's grace that every year he told the people to go camping, to go and live in the wilderness, in a tent, a temporary structure, and to enjoy God's provision. And so the Festival of Booths is one of those things that it seems weird, but it also, like, the way that people would observe it over time, like some people would go out into the wilderness, some people would build a booth on the roof of their house and live on the roof for a week. But all of these different festivals, all these different things are about remembering God's provision and how he has rescued them. So next week,
I thought you said the Festival of Booze. I was like, that's something I can get behind.
No.
Booth.
Boths. Booths.
Got it.
So, yeah, there is one festival where they are to bring the wine as a part of the offering to the Lord, a hin of wine. And so they were not opposed to celebrating with wine from time to time. But it is booth, not booze. So, yeah, that's in October. Oktoberfest. So, yeah. All right. Well, y'all have a good week. And on Sunday, if you're able to join us in person, 9 and 11, you don't have to register. You can come and be a part of a Sunday worship. And if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. It's so good. Things are opening. And I'm hoping we're working on getting some air conditioning in the building here, because in the summertime it gets really hot. And if the city and the permitting stuff doesn't allow us over the summer, in the fall, when it cools down a bit, I definitely want to get in person and meet here and do this together, because it's these kinds of groups are much more fun in person. And so it's just stay tuned. We'll keep working on all that stuff. So, but yeah, y'all have a good week. Read Leviticus 25 through 27 for next week, and we will wrap up this book with all its skin conditions and weirdness. We've done it.
Thank you, Jason.
Hi, Jason.
See you guys.
Thanks, Jason. Bye.